Today, please mind the gap. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian and New Zealand flavour. And today I'm joined again by Joe Wilkes. Hello, Joe.
Hi, Martin.
How are you going?
Yeah, much better than I was yesterday. I've celebrated the Liverpool win in the Champions League, so I'm much better now.
Well, you can mourn the loss of the British cricket team or the English cricket team overnight, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm not too fussed about that. Plenty of time to go in that competition still. Good to see you. Good to see you. I thought, another week on and lots happening.
There's a lot of data flying around, and it's looking quite wobbly in places, isn't it?
Yeah, we've had some stats out today from the Real Estate Institute of New Zealand about the change in asking price month on month. The good news is that prices on the west coast of the South Island, their asking prices went up by 12.2% over the course of the month. The not so good news is that there's been some fairly dramatic falls in other parts of the country. Auckland recorded a 2.7% fall in their average asking price last month. Northland down 3.3%, Coromandel down 5.1%, Central North Island down 4.8%. So it's a very fragmented market at the moment. The South Island asking prices are going up. Top of the North Island and many of the sort of the areas that the Aucklanders have historically moved to, those prices are falling. And I don't know, I'm looking at the sort of the gap in the data that you see from the Real Estate Institute. The lending figures that the RBNZ have published aren't horrific in terms of growth in new lending. If you look at the new lending aggregates, January 2018, 3.696 billion. January 2019, more lending, 4.051 billion. February 2018, there were 4.667 billion lent. February 19, an increase in the total new lending to 4.798 billion. In March of 2018, 5.852 billion. This dropped off in 2019 to 5.769 billion. Shortly after that, the Governor of the Reserve Bank cuts cash rate. And in April 2018, 5.375 billion, small increase in April 2019, which is the month of the cash rate cut, to 5.452 billion. So the lending there is not majorly different. It's not growing, but you can see that it's not declining massively. But when you go and actually look at the stats on the transactions, this is where you get a slightly different picture. But we have a significant drop-off in transactions, and I thought that we should discuss this today because we touched on in our first post together, I think, more on the New Zealand property market, this impact of the marginal buyer. And we're starting to see some really, really significant drop-offs in the volume of transactions, particularly in Auckland, particularly at the top end of the market. And it is this missing liquidity. It's almost as if... I'll be careful what I say, but if you were a nation state with foul mind and thoughts about how you could interfere with another country's economy, the easiest way to create a bubble in property is to go out and arm your buyers with heavy amounts of liquidity and set them at work in the top ends of the market. There's no point if you're trying not to cause a disruption. There's no point going to the west coast of the South Island and buying everything up there, because that has very little impact on the overall debt levels that we've seen grow exponentially in New Zealand. We've nearly doubled our household debt since the GFC. But if you want to, I suppose you need a bit of help from some friendly banking and some lax banking regulation. But if you wanted to really undermine the market, what you do is you'd go to the most expensive suburbs and buy up the most expensive properties, and that in itself will create a competition within the local market. If they wanted to compete, they've got to go and take on a lot of debt to do so. But the people that do sell those houses, they then filter that cash out across the rest of the country, as you know, those who've cashed up on the Great Central Auckland prices move out and make the regions expensive, and those who are wanting to compete in the regions stay in an area that they've lived in forever. They too then have to leverage very, very heavily to compete again. So we're getting some data now, and I've been really fortunate over the last few weeks, developed a relationship with a guy called Mike Kirk, who I suppose to say is probably one of the most honest estate agents that I've come across over in New Zealand.
That's an oxymoron, isn't it? Oh, I shouldn't say that.
I mean, I was an agent for many years, and I do respect the industry, but I think that there's always this sort of false narrative. If you don't get in now, you're never going to buy, and sometimes people neglect the realities of the data. And in a correcting market, and I worked through this in the UK, not communicating the reality of what is happening to your client base can cost your clients thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. It can cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I saw this in the UK, where an agent would take on a house and they'd stick it on at $1 million because that's what the owners wanted them to hear, when the reality is it was 900,000. And then by the time they'd actually come to the reality that it was not $1 million, the market had slipped to 800,000, and the client had been, they'd lost out because the agent wasn't focusing on the bigger issues in the market. Mike, thankfully, he's got some numbers in his blood, so he's somebody that you and I get on very well with. Okay, so Mike's done some investigation of the various districts around the Auckland region, and this is where, going back to this first-time buyer, there was a heavy weight of money that went in and has been raised either by cash or by debt offshore, and has hit the top end of the market over the last few years. Yep. I'll send you a CoreLogic graph, which I went to a seminar for recently. And CoreLogic, what they do is they look at all the new listings that come onto the market and how they're being marketed, whether it be by auction, by tender, with an asking price or another means. And you can see over the last 2 or 3 years, there's just been a dramatic decrease in the number of houses that are being listed for auction. Right. So we've talked about in the past our auction clearance rates, and they're pretty abysmal at the moment. They're hovering around 28%. And this is very different because the volume of auctions is tiny compared to where it was in 14, 15, 16, when everything was going crazy. Now, when you look at the Auckland market by price banding, Auckland City itself, so this is a central suburb where lots of cash has gone, the over $2 million sales transaction numbers is down 35% in the first 4 months of this year compared to last year. So we've had our foreign buyer ban. Immediately, 35% fewer houses sold for more than 2 million. That has a knock-on, because if fewer people are getting 2 million, which probably isn't being raised by debt in the New Zealand market, then that's going to have an impact on other areas. 0.2 million plus bracket, Mike's broken down by region. So overall, Auckland, and this is over 1.2 million to 2 million, Auckland is down 33%, so there are a third fewer sales taking place over north of 1.2 million. The Albany ward is down 43%. North Shore City is down by 38%. Orewa is down by 40%. Red Beach is down by 43.7%. And Auckland City down by 35%. So huge drop off in the higher end or middle upper end transaction volumes. Between 1 and 2 million, there's still activity. Auckland overall is down 18%. North Shore City down by 20%. Silverdale down by 26.5%. This is transaction volumes, not prices. Stanmore Bay, Gulf Harbour, and Manly, they're largely unchanged. And Mike says this is an area where a lot of the foreign agents or foreign-based agents are based. Going into the 800,000 to 1.2 million bracket, Auckland City down 24%, so total transactions. North Shore City and Albany ward down 27%. Red Beach down 11%. Silverdale down 24%. Orewa down 34%. So again, even in that 800 to 1.2 million, and you think, average income in New Zealand is around median income's around $57,000. So you double that up, you're still looking at 800 to 1.2 million, quite big multiples of household income to get there. The 600 to 800,000 bracket, and this would probably be where there'd be a few investors offloading things before we see a further deterioration in the market, which I can't see anything other than that now. Auckland, Albany Ward, and North Shore City all down between 17 and 18% in terms of transaction volumes. Orrowa down 12%, Red Beach down 33%, Silverdale down 45%. Not a big sample there, and Stanmore Bay, which is an investor and first-time buyer suburb, is down just 3%. So where it's affordable, people are still able to get in. But in total, the volumes of transactions are now lower than they were in 2008 for that comparison of those 4-month periods. So there's going to be pressure out there. If it's incomes for real estate agents, they're going to be finding that there's less property that people are willing to sell. There's no shortage of property on the market. The Real Estate Institute of New Zealand's come out and said that at the end of May, there's more properties available than we've had in 7 years at the end of May. And the average listing time, the amount of stock to cover the rates of sales in the market is also at its highest in 7 or 8 years. So we've got a big gap that is forming in this liquidity in the marketplace that is available for all of these subsequent moves to happen. One move often doesn't just end with one move unless it's a new building. For other people to move, then you need to have some liquidity entering either at the top end of the market or at the lower end to facilitate those other movements. And I think one of the things that I would say we're likely to see here is that so many of the first-time buyer options have been bought over the last 5 or 6 years, that when they come back to the market, because it's investors offloading them, there isn't necessarily a subsequent onward transaction. So the money just stops at the bottom of the market. And without that capital injection at the top end, which was facilitating people trading down and people trading out of the regions, where there's still some price growth in the regions, but without the same amount of that liquidity, we're going to see some really, really interesting dynamics as we go through the rest of this year. And I don't think cutting the cash rate is going to make a blind bit of difference when you just look at the drop off in the volumes.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And certainly my experience here in Australia and in the UK is the top end tends to go first and the top end tends to drop furthest, right? For all the reasons that you said, not least because people perhaps have more options and particularly will think about, well, I'm not going to invest in property if property prices are not going to go up, all those sorts of things. So they tend to have more options initially. But the cascading effect down the market is pretty fascinating. It does put ever more focus, though, on the bottom end of the market and those first-time buyers who are still being cajoled to come into the market. Now, great time to buy, property prices are down, plenty of finance available, buy now, right? And that's where I think the Trafford accident is likely to happen at the end of the day, so as the whole market begins to go sideways.
Yeah, I think we'll see the concertina, and I saw it in the UK. So the top end of the market fell the furthest, fell by the biggest percentages, and the lower end of the market, there is a cushion or a buffer at some point. But the thing about this is that because there are so many people in New Zealand who are renting properties, when those houses get shifted into the for sale market, often they're not going to produce a buyer because the tenant just needs somewhere else to rent, because they don't have the ability to go and purchase. That's why many are renting. But they're not going to produce a second time purchaser for these 800 to 1 million properties, the 1 to 1.2s. And some of those people previously would have been benefiting from that downscale. So I don't think it's happened to the great extent. You could just see volumes at the lower end haven't fallen off nearly as much as they have in the middle, and at the top end it's been the most dramatic. Where do we find the liquidity to replace it? It can only be through debt, and we're struggling, I think, to maintain those debt levels.
Yeah, and certainly the momentum in the credit, even in Australia now, we've got housing credit still growing at close to 4%, just below 3.9, I think it is. It's people keep saying to me, well, how can things be so bad if in fact credit is still growing, And it's growing in New Zealand a little bit. But the point there to make is it's the rate of new credit that's the critical thing, right? And remember that a lot of people will still be trying to refinance, and particularly if there are attractor rates being offered by lenders trying to pull people into the market. I know there are some very amazing rates now in New Zealand being offered by some of the banks for people willing to refinance. So you've got to take account of that as being an extra incentive. And I do still notice here in Australia that some of the refinancing includes more equity drawdown. So I suspect you'll find the same as in New Zealand. So you have to take account of equity drawdown, firstly. You have to take account of the fact that there are still some incremental new buyers coming into the market, although that may be smaller. And you put all that together, and you can actually begin to understand that you can still have a rate of credit growth when home prices are falling.
Exactly.
Right? But it's the rate of change of credit, and if that continues to go lower, then absolutely home prices will continue to go lower, because those two things are correlated. Because all of the theories about the way that money works suggest that the only way you can make home prices go up is to have an increasing rate of change of credit supply. In other words, you have to actually cajole more and more people to get into the market with bigger and bigger mortgages to be able to support the property market. That's the big Ponzi scheme, as it were, right?
And that is what must be happening here. People must be borrowing more and more and more, because the volumes are so much lower than they were just 2 years ago. So we've gone from over 30,000 annual transactions in Auckland just 3 years ago, and it's looking at the moment that we'll struggle to get to, I think we'll probably get to 15 or 16,000 sales this year. So you've got a huge change in that momentum. There will be people, and there always are, and in a market that goes up and a market that goes down, there are people who get very lucky on the way up, and there are people who get lucky on the way down, because so often things are being compared to everything that isn't selling, rather than the reality of what the market is now bearing. I used to describe this as steps when talking about it to clients. You have, on the way up, as an agent, what you find is that you put a house on the market at $1 million, you have 5 people that want to buy it, and they compete, and it might get to 1,010,000. What that does is it takes a buyer out of the market, so you've got four buyers who are there. Now, it's quite likely that one of those buyers couldn't afford more than $1 million anyway, but the other 3 buyers have this experience of loss. So as agents, the next similar house, you tend to put it on for a little bit more, because that experience of loss determines the appetite to make sure that it happens. None of us husbands want to spend too long in spare bedrooms. We haven't bought our wife a house. So the second house could go for 1,050,000. One more buyer will get taken out of the market. You've got 2 left, but actually one of those can't afford more than 1,050,000. And the third house that comes into the market comes on at 1.1, because there's one person with expectations, having missed out twice, and he will stretch to make it happen that third time. Often that's the point that the market adjusts, and that's what we're seeing around Auckland, because when that one person gets 1.1 million for their house on their road, the rest of the road think, oh, bloody brilliant, I'll cash up. And within a month or two, sometimes you can end up with 3 or 4 houses all on the market at 1.1 million. What they don't realize is that they're really waiting for the other guy who missed out a while before at less than 1,050,000. Someone will drop and take him, but then he might get 4 or 5 houses all sat there at 1.1 million, and the buyer ability is at 1, because that's where the only other buyer is who hasn't missed out on those properties on the way up. So it's why when property markets do correct, you often get this very, very sharp correction initially, and the Sproikers are doing their very, very best to say that it isn't happening here. I've read a wonderful article early this morning where they're talking about South Island prices, asking prices are rising, and in the North Island, asking prices are in a holding pattern. I'm like, no, they're not. Some areas they've fallen 5% in a month. So the language used is not quite right. But agents, and good agents like Mike, they will be able to go out there and advise their clients on the real information, the real data in a location, and talk to their clients and say, look, this is a demonstration. You can be on the market with all these other houses that aren't selling, or you can go and position yourselves at a point to try and attract the next buyer. Do it before everybody else, because by the time that others because if others beat you to it, you'll be having to find the next buyer who will be at a lower point. So the whole expectations are changing. We're living in I suppose, the denial phase that it can't happen in New Zealand because we're different. But I can't see anything now with the data coming forward that the smart sellers, because we're now in a market that isn't dictated by the marginal buyer. The marginal buyer pays more than everybody on the way up, and they blow everyone out of the water. We're now at the point of the marginal seller is the key to all things, because the marginal seller will attract the fewer buyers that are comfortable committing to a market where they may be catching a falling knife for a period of time.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And, just to give you another contrast, over here, of course, we just had the election and, the coalition got back in and suddenly everybody's saying, everything's now wonderful, right? And one of the things I've noticed now is that whereas sellers here were willing to discount because they knew that the market was actually weaker, right? That appears to have changed. So effectively, suddenly they're saying, I'm going to hold my ground now. And, I'm not going to discount, by 5 to 8% or whatever it is to be able to get a sale, because I think that the property market is a little stronger. And of course, all the spruikers out there are saying, that's, the property market's turned, prices are going to go up again. So, hold on. I have a feeling that we're going to see that really shake out over the next few weeks, because it just doesn't make sense in the context of what's really happening on the ground from two data points. Firstly, if you go granular on home price movements rather than averages, you can see that prices in some places have gone down more than 30% now, right, across Sydney. Second point is the number of buyers able and willing and wanting to buy is still very, very low. And so therefore, I think a lot of sellers here who are now being way more optimistic about the situation are going to catch a cold, simply because of that broader dynamic that you talked about, which is that in a falling market, the ratcheting down, that doesn't turn around in a few weeks. That's a force that becomes very, very powerful over time, and essentially becomes part of that self-defeating spiraling down as property prices continue to fall.
Yeah, well, I think you'll probably see what we saw in the UK during 2010, 11, 12. Base rate had been cut to 0.5%, and we were struggling to sort of get traction in the marketplace. When you do get this bounce, what happens is that the fact that people's expectations rise again because of what they're hearing in the press, it actually then decreases the volume of credit growth, because the transactions just don't happen, and therefore you get that spiral. And that's why over the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years, the volume of credit growth in the UK has been really sort of minuscule in terms of it's still growing, but it has been minuscule. But at the same time, you're seeing retailers going out of business. Debenhams has gone. Boots are just about to close 200 stores. All of those things because the market needs more credit. I would argue the quicker you get to the point that it's all flushed out of the system and you've seen through your bad debts and you got rid of all your problems, that's the point that you can then look at working on credit growth, but hopefully credit growth that's slightly better regulated by the authorities over the lenders.
Yeah, well, of course, the issue there is that we're doing everything here. If you look at the regulators, you look at the Reserve Bank, you look at the government, to try and actually keep talking the bubble longer rather than allowing the force of gravity to really work through. Because I agree with you, we have to flush this out ultimately, because this is unsustainable. Where we are is unsustainable. It's unsustainable here in the amount of debt and ratios of income to prices, same as in New Zealand, wacky, absolutely wacky. But everybody's wanting to hold on to that pre-correction scenario, thinking that if we can hang on just a bit longer, maybe we can turn the ship around. And I think that probably it's way past that now. The iceberg's there right ahead of us. And frankly, the sooner we allow the collision to happen and then, deal with the aftermath, the better. Because otherwise, this is going to go on for years and years and years.
Yeah, well, I think that they've done some interesting things in Australia, and announcing that they won't implement this first-time buyer grant until January. That's actually a disincentive for first-time buyers to get into the market. We had the same thing over here. Well, we're going to produce these Kiwi build houses, which there is no point in producing because they're so expensive that you can't afford to buy them, and generally everything's getting cheaper anyway. So the idea of the prices that they were quoting just out the realms of sensibility. So you put a deadline on it. What does that do? First time buyer, I'll sit on my hands, I'll wait. We saw all sorts of weird decisions made in the UK. We're going to go and introduce a stamp duty change, which will bring down the cost of stamp duty for certain people, but we're going to do it in 12 months' time. All right, I'll just sit on my hands for 6 months and wait and see what happens. So trying to manipulate the market with those sorts of policies, you're onto hiding for nothing, because a lot of the first-time buyers will look at it and think, okay, I'll just wait. I'll wait and see what happens or what the market's looking like in January.
And I go back to George Bush in the US, right, in the early 2000s. He actually was talking similar thoughts here in terms of, we want to increase the reach of borrowers to enable them to get houses. We're going to do stuff for the first time market, right? That was the seed that ultimately led to the global financial crisis and all the things following, right? And I just think we haven't learnt a thing. We're just going around the same traps again.
Yep. Yeah, well, we've got a big gap that is building in level of expectation, sales volumes, and there aren't enough people with deep pockets. And despite what the REI and Z are doing, there are times that what do they say? You can't polish a turd, but you can roll it in glitter. But either way, it still stinks.
That's quite a thought, Joe. Thank you. Talk to you soon. Cheers.
Take care, Martin.
So there you have it, a very important message from Joe there about the gap. And I think we're going to hear more of this ahead. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.